Hi, thank you, Danielle and Oregon Wild, for having me today and also for the great introduction. My topic is the sea otter comeback, reviving Oregon's marine ecosystem. My name is Chanel Hason. I'm the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the nonprofit, the Elakha Alliance. Danielle gave me a great introduction, so I won't dive too deep into my past, but I just wanted you to get to know me a little bit better. My background is in marine biology. I'm a rescue scuba diver, science communicator, environmental educator, marketing guru, all that fun stuff. I've loved the ocean since I was 5, holding that sea star there next to my mom, and continued that passion until today. I've lived all over the world, Australia, Puerto Rico, and am so excited to be here to talk to you about sea otters. So the outline of my presentation today, we're going to talk a little bit about sea otter biology, and then we'll go over to estuary and kelp forest ecology, and then we'll jump into the past, present, and future of sea otters here in Oregon. So let's talk about everyone's favorite furry marine mammal, the sea otter. They are part of the Mustelidae family, which is also the weasel family. So they're related to wolverines and badgers and minks. There's 3 subspecies. We have the northern sea otter in Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska, the southern sea otter, which is only in California, and then we have the Asian or Russian sea otter, which ranges from, you guessed it, Russia and northeast Japan. They spend the majority of their time floating on their backs in the ocean. That's where they eat, that's where they sleep, and that's where they groom themselves. And the moms only have 1 pup a year. And their life expectancy is about 10 to 20 years. And they like to aggregate in floating rafts, usually by sex. And they're not a migratory species, which answers a lot of questions people ask. Why don't they just naturally come back to Oregon? They don't migrate, so they have really high site fidelity. So they like to be where they were born, basically. And most every marine mammal in the world has a thick layer of blubber to keep them warm in chilly waters, except for sea otters. So instead of a thick layer of fat, they rely on that really soft, smooth fur coat that keeps them warm. It's the densest fur of any animal in the whole entire animal kingdom, with up to 600,000 to 1,000,000 hairs per square inch. And if you make the OK symbol, that's about 1 square inch. So it's really, really thick. And it actually consists of 2 layers, an undercoat and a longer guard hair coat. And so otters need this double layer system that traps air next to their skin, preventing it from getting wet and protecting them from the chilly ocean waters. And next time, if you find us tabling at an event or anything, we have a sea otter pelt that you can feel. It's very, very soft. They also have one at the Oregon Zoo and the Oregon Coast Aquarium and the Hatfield Marine Science Center if you want to visit and touch a sea otter pelt. Sea otters are also eating machines. They eat about 25% of their body weight a day. They have a super high metabolism, so they have to constantly eat. So for a 70-pound sea otter, that means they need to eat about 20 pounds of food every single day, which is about 3.6 tons a year. They eat a wide range of different critters, lots of crustaceans like sea urchins, crabs, mussels, and clams, but they also snack on octopus and marine worms. And each diet varies between each individual. It's usually based on what their mom taught them to eat. And I'll also point out it's very rare for sea otters to eat fish. Mostly river otters eat fish, so oftentimes that's a confusion for people. And they're also super highly intelligent creatures. You probably know this, but they use rocks often to crack open hard-shelled invertebrates. And I'll debunk everyone's favorite fact about sea otters, that they have a favorite rock that they just keep in their armpit pocket and swim around willy-nilly and have their favorite rock. That's not true. They usually use a new rock every single time. So sorry if that was your favorite fact. But yeah, That's pretty much it for their food. So sea otters have these short, blunt skulls, and they actually have fracture-resistant teeth, which is how they don't break their tooth every time they chomp down on a mussel or a sea urchin. Um, and they have the same bite force equivalent to a black bear, which is about 80 pounds. So a very strong bite also helps them eat all their hard-shelled critters. A fun fact, you are what you eat. So sea otters really like to eat purple sea urchins. And so on this image, you'll see a skull of a sea otter that is stained purple. And this phenomenon is known as echinochrome staining. And it occurs when it eats a copious amount of echinochrome containing prey, like the purple sea urchin. It's pretty fascinating. So unfortunately, we do have threats to sea otters. There's predation by orcas or sharks, and increased in some areas. There's oil spills, which can obviously harm their precious fur coat, reducing insulation and hypothermia, and entanglement in fishing gear, which can lead to drowning or injury. Diseases from pollution, such as toxoplasmosis, which comes from cat feces. Climate change, which disrupts prey availability like sea urchins and shellfish. Human disturbances like boating or tourism can cause stress, and habitat loss from coastal development affects food and shelter as well. Now let's move on to a more positive topic, how sea otters play a key role in establishing healthy estuaries. So let's visit an estuary that has sea otters, and that one is the Elkhorn Slough in California. It's one of California's largest and most significant estuaries, located near Monterey Bay. If you've never been there, I highly suggest you go. It is amazing. Provides a rich habitat for diverse wildlife, including over 340 species of birds, obviously sea otters, fish, and invertebrates. And the slough supports important tidal marshes, mudflats, and grasslands, making it a vital site for conservation and research, which you'll learn a lot about. Its ecosystems play a crucial role in filtering water and providing nurseries for marine species like the sea otter. There's lots of pups born in the Elkhorn Slough, which is also another fun thing to go see for yourself if you go on a very nice eco tour there. And the Elkhorn Slough is a key area for environmental education and ecotourism, particularly for bird watching and kayaking. So sea otters help in the recovery of eelgrass. One researcher in particular, Dr. Brent Hughes out of Sonoma State University, has been the front runner in discovering the interconnectedness of sea otters and estuary health. His research discovered that sea otters play a crucial role in supporting eelgrass health in the Elkhorn Slough by controlling populations of crabs and other invertebrates that feed on these small organisms like sea slugs, which help keep eelgrass free of harmful algae. And without sea otters, these crabs become more abundant and reduce the number of these algae-eating sea slugs, which leads to excessive growth, algae growth on top of the eelgrass blade itself. And this algae can block sunlight and hinder eelgrass growth, which is not good for, obviously, the eelgrass to thrive. And so sea otters help in that recovery. So it allows the eelgrass to photosynthesize, thrive, and also captures carbon as well. So once again, Dr. Brent Hughes did some more research that came out last year. Sea otters were on the cover of Nature magazine in 2024, which highlighted how sea otters help reduce coastal erosion, once again in the Elkhorn Slough. And the key mechanism involves the otter's predation on marsh crabs, which would otherwise burrow into the soil and eat the plant's roots. And these crabs destabilize the marsh, contributing to erosion. And so by controlling the crab population, sea otters allow the marsh vegetation to thrive, leading to stronger root systems that protect against erosion. And in areas where sea otters have returned, erosion has been reduced up to 90%, which is incredible. So we'll talk a little bit about why that's important for us to know in terms of an Oregon reintroduction. Let me take a sip. So just recently, some more research came out on the Elkhorn Slough, and this one has been getting national coverage, was featured on NPR, I think yesterday, that sea otters are controlling invasive European green crab populations in the slough. So they estimate that the southern sea otters consume between 50,000 to 120,000 green crabs annually, helping to keep this invasive species in check. So the presence of sea otters has been associated with the reduced numbers of European green crabs and thus healthier eelgrass habitats. So this suggests that reintroducing sea otters to areas like Oregon could aid in managing our problem with the same invasive European green crab species. So in summary, when you have sea otters in an estuary, everyone is winning. We have increased water quality, there's better habitats for juvenile invertebrates like salmon and crabs to migratory birds, and we've got increased carbon storage through eelgrass and decreased erosion. No wonder why people refer to sea otters as climate change warriors. Woohoo! Next, let's dive into a kelp forest ecosystem. Let me know if that's too loud. So giant kelp forests, or just kelp forests in general, comprise 25% of the world's coastline, from California all the way to Australia, South Africa, and Central America. And they are one of the ocean's most diverse ecosystems. Many fish species use kelp forests as nurseries for their young, while marine mammals like sea lions, sea otters, and even gray whales use it as a shelter from predators and storms. Kelp forests thrive in cold, nutrient-rich water, and although it looks like a plant, it's actually a large brown macroalgae, which I'll talk about in a second. This is in Monterey Bay, one of my favorite places to go scuba diving. All right, let's talk about what kelp is, the structure of kelp is. So here in Oregon, we mostly have bull kelp, which is the kelp on the left photograph there. Bull kelp are annuals, only living a maximum about 18 months. They can grow up to 100 feet with a growth rate up to 25 centimeters or about 10 inches per day. And the drawing on the right depicts a giant kelp, which is predominant mostly off the coast of California. We do have some small percentage of giant kelp off of Oregon too. The giant kelp is not only the largest of all the kelps, but is the largest algae too. And a single giant kelp can be over 200 feet tall and grow at a rate of about 2 feet every day. Pretty wild, huh? So despite their appearance, kelps are not plants. They are grouped within algae and are known also as seaweeds. Algae are similar to plants in that they use photosynthesis to harness the sun's energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and sugars, which they then use for growth. But while plants rely on roots to secure to the ground and structured vessels to transport nutrients, algae hold onto the sea floor or rocks using holdfasts and transport nutrients from cell to cell. In general, the kelp anatomy includes the root-like holdfasts, which I just talked about, and a stem-like stipe, and then leaf-like fronds or blades. And some species also have a bulbous air-filled bladder called a pneumatocyst that helps the heavy frond blades float to the surface where there's ample sun where they can photosynthesize. So the bull kelp just has one big stipe. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, and then has the blades at the surface to photosynthesize. And giant kelp has multiple fronds, a stipe with a bulb and a blade that go up the whole entire main stipe. So why are underwater forests the best? In my own personal opinion, and hopefully for you too. They're biodiversity hotspots. So they provide shelter and food for a wide range of marine species, from tiny invertebrates to large predators like the gray whale and sea otters. Carbon sequestration is also really key. They absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, helping to mitigate climate change. Coastal protection, they act as natural barriers, reducing wave energy and preventing shoreline erosion. They also, through photosynthesis, produce oxygen, supporting life both underwater and on land. And they support fisheries that are sustained or harvested sustainably, especially here in Oregon. And they provide ecosystem balance. So they help maintain healthy marine environments by regulating species populations and nutrient cycles. So like I mentioned, kelp helps fight climate change. So the large macroalgae are super carbon absorbers due to their extraordinary growth rate, which we talked about, of up to 2 feet a day. And by some measures, underwater forests sequester 20 times more carbon per acre than terrestrial forests do. And kelp forests play a crucial role in supporting gray whales, specifically off the coast of Oregon, by providing habitat for essential prey like krill and small fish. These ecosystems also serve as a protective environment, excuse me, offering shelter and feeding grounds for whales during their migration along the Pacific coast. And a recent study indicated that gray whales in the Pacific Coast Feeding Group have decreased in size by over 13%. Sorry, I need to drink some water. Hold on one second. That gray whales have decreased in size by over 13% in the past 2 decades. And whales born in 2020 are expected to be significantly smaller than those that were born before 2000, which may lead to reproductive health challenges and signal broader ecosystem issues. So researchers don't know the direct cause of this, but environmentally driven changes could be a factor. So let's talk about the kelp and carbon cycle. So the kelp carbon cycle is nature's way of moving carbon in and out of kelp forests, and here's how it works in simple terms. So kelp uses sunlight and carbon dioxide from the water during photosynthesis to grow, and this process helps remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And then as kelp grows, it stores carbon in its blades, stipes, and holdfasts. And then when animals eat kelp, the carbon stored in it moves up the food chain, supporting other marine life. And then when the kelp dies, it sinks to the ocean floor or decomposes in shallow waters, releasing some carbon back into the water or burying it into deep sediments where it can stay for thousands of years. And then the process repeats as new kelp grows, absorbing more carbon and continuing the cycle. And this cycle not only supports marine ecosystems, but helps, sorry, I practiced this presentation earlier and I kept getting a scratchy throat, so I apologize. The new kelp grows, absorbing more carbon and continuing, let's see, where did I leave off? The cycle not only supports marine ecosystems, but also helps regulates the Earth's carbon balance. There you go. All right. So thanks to Dr. Jim Estey's groundbreaking research, we know that sea otters play a really crucial role in maintaining the balance in kelp forest ecosystems because they are a keystone species. And I just love to show these incredible photographs by photographer Ralph Pace because it's very hard to get a clear photo of sea otters, especially underwater, because they are so darn quick. And so I'm really excited when he came out with these photographs, I think a couple years ago, that are beautiful and featured, I think, in Nat Geo. So a keystone species is one that has an effect on its environment disproportionate to its abundance. So in other words, just a few individuals can have a really big impact. So an example of this is how sea otters prey on sea urchins. So sea urchins consume kelp, the canopy-forming algae species that creates our underwater forests, And these underwater forests provide food, shelter, and nurseries for thousands of species, which you all know now. And as urchin density decreases from sea otter predation, so does the grazing pressure on kelp. And as a result, kelp forests flourish in the presence of sea otters. So this top-down influence on the nearshore prey species can help uh, help result in changes in community structure, including maintaining a more diverse nearshore ecosystem. So all positive things for sea otters in kelp forests. So let's switch gears and focus on Oregon's kelp forests. And that photo was taken a couple years ago off of Port Orford at Redfish Rocks. So the Oregon Kelp Alliance recently released an Oregon kelp forest status report. And the slides here represent the change in kelp canopy cover from 2010 to 2022. It's one of the many fascinating statistics on the health of our kelp forests outlined in this report. So since 2010, Oregon's kelp forests have faced a dramatic decline, about down 66.4% in southern areas and 73.5% statewide. Some regions like Cape Blanco have lost up to 95% of their kelp canopy, impacting ecosystems and costing the state millions annually. This decline is primarily driven by a combination of factors, including warming ocean temperatures, overgrazing by unchecked sea urchin populations, and the loss of key predators like the sea otter and sunflower sea stars. These changes threaten not only marine biodiversity, but also the economic and cultural livelihoods tied to Oregon's coastal communities. So, in late 2013, a marine heat wave that you can see mapped there on the left, known as the blob, began warming the ocean throughout the Northeast Pacific, causing temperatures to rise almost 3 degrees Celsius above normal, which may not seem like a lot to us, but for small little invertebrates, that's a huge deal. So linked to this ocean warming trend, sunflower sea stars, also known as Pycnopodia, have faced catastrophic declines due to sea star wasting disease that emerged also in 2013. So scientists and researchers think that is possibly linked to this marine heat wave. So over 90% of sunflower sea stars have been lost across their range, which spans from Alaska to Baja California. And in some areas on the west coast of the US, populations have declined by 99%, and that includes Oregon. And in 2020, the International Union for Conservation of Nature listed sunflower sea stars as critically endangered. So the dramatic loss has disrupted marine ecosystems, especially kelp forests, as sunflower sea stars are major predators of sea urchins. So these sea stars have been keeping Oregon's ecosystems in balance with the loss of sea otters. And now we have two key predators of sea urchins missing in the kelp forest ecosystem. But there are conservation efforts focusing specifically on disease research of sea star wasting disease, habitat restoration, and there's also sunflower sea star breeding programs to aid in their recovery. So as a visual learner, I like to showcase kind of visually the difference between a healthy kelp forest compared to what's known as an urchin barren, where sea urchins are missing their key predators, hence sea otters and sunflower sea stars, and now are blanketing the seafloor in purple and devouring algae, including kelp, at a very alarming rate. So sea urchins are natural to the marine ecosystem, but when the ecosystem is out of balance and the predators are missing, they come out from their hiding places in nooks and crevices of the rocky reef because they don't have anything to be afraid of. And unfortunately, they just consume all the algae and all the kelp, and we're left with an urchin barren. And so something interesting about sea urchins is that they can turn into a zombie state. What does that mean? No, they don't turn green. But what they do is they go into a starvation mode. So in areas where kelp forests have declined, sea urchins lack their primary food source and enter a survival mode, aka zombie mode. They stop reproducing because they don't have enough energy, focused instead on basic survival. And their metabolism slows down drastically, allowing them to survive for extended periods without adequate nutrition for up to a whole year, which is wild and horrible for an animal consuming kelp forest at an alarming rate. And despite their weakened state, they continue to consume whatever kelp and algae they can find, worsening the damage to already struggling ecosystems. So in this photograph here, the sea urchins to the left that kind of look brown inside, those are zombie urchins. So they basically kind of starve themselves. They're not eating, and they're kind of just eating their own insides from the inside out. And then the urchins with the bright yellow inside them, those are healthy sea urchins, and those bright yellow insides are their gonads. So if you eat sushi, sometimes you'll see uni on the menu. Those are sea urchin gonads. Apparently a delicacy. I have never tried it. So if you have, let me know your thoughts. So these zombie urchins can persist in barren underwater landscapes, preventing kelp recovery and perpetuating the cycle of ecosystem degradation. So we don't like that. So what does that mean for the future of sea otters in Oregon? And we'll talk about the past. So here's a quick timeline. We've got about 2 million years ago, sea otters evolved somewhere near modern day Russia, eventually expanding their population to the entire North Pacific from Baja California to Japan. Then 10,000 years ago, Native Americans arrived to the Pacific Northwest, and sea otters thrived along the Oregon coast and became an integral part of the culture of the people there. So locations in Oregon today, like Otter Rock and Otter Point, are direct translations of names given to these places by the Tillamook and Tutuni people that lived along the coast. And 115 years ago marked the end of the maritime fur trade, which began in the mid-1700s, where sea otters were aggressively hunted throughout their range for their thick fur pelts. Russian hunters started in the Aleutian Islands in Alaska and often used forced labor of Aleutian Islanders and ultimately reached as far south as Northern California. Subsequently, the British led the rush to trade with the Northwest Coast Native Americans for their luxurious pelts, and then the last wave, Americans dominated the trade from the 1970s onward until it petered out due to overhunting in the mid to late 19th century. And then 55 years ago, marked the first attempt at a translocation of sea otters here on the Oregon coast. So let's dive into some of those a little more deeply. So we know here in Oregon, there's at least 6 different terms for sea otter in different indigenous languages. Elakha, the top one there, it comes from a Chinook trade jargon word for sea otter. And coastal elders have long shared stories about the unique role of sea otter pelts played in their communities. So sea otter furs were seen as treasures, symbolizing wealth and status, were often used as regalia as well in ceremonies. A high-ranking elder might wear a finely made sea otter robe to inspire awe or offer one as a meaningful gift during diplomatic exchanges. And traditional stories often highlight sea otter skins as rare and valued prizes, awarded to those who were clever, strong, or fortunate. And in some areas, these narratives also reflect the deep respect for sea otters, viewing them as kin, connected to the natural cycles that provided food and prosperity. And I want to point out something really big is that found in shell middens along the Oregon coast, which were kind of like discard piles for indigenous peoples, were found both northern subspecies and southern subspecies of sea otter bones. which meant Oregon was a place where the two subspecies intermingled with each other, which is huge. So bringing sea otters back to Oregon might have a really big implication, increasing the genetic diversity of the sea otter species as a whole. If the southern subspecies from California swam up to Oregon, if they were reintroduced to Northern California to intermix possibly with northern sea otters. And then the maritime fur trade, which we touched upon. So specifically in Oregon, Robert Gray's crew was the first American vessel to join the lucrative sea otter trade. And his vessel was the reason why we named the Columbia River. The Columbia River was named after his vessel. And so that's a photo of them coming into present day Astoria. So indigenous peoples became unwitting participants in a global economy as they shifted from subsistence to market hunting and operating with a debit credit system devised by fur trade accountants. With the introduction of disease, displacement and loss of land, and cultural disruption and forced I'm just gonna skip that because my brain's not working right now. The fur trade was very detrimental to indigenous peoples up and down the North Pacific coastline. In essence, the fur trade played a key role in the destabilization and exploitation of indigenous communities in Oregon, leading to lasting cultural, economic, and social harm. And we know the last sea otter pelt was traded in 1910 based on an article in the Coos Bay Times paper. And that was the last known evidence of a sea otter pelt or a live sea otter on the Oregon coast. And I always like using this illustration from Cook's Voyage of a sea otter because I don't know what kind of sea otter they were looking at, but apparently it was gigantic based on the proportion size of the trees and the otter. Just is quite humorous. So 99% of the global population of sea otters were extirpated during the fur trade. So that's about 1 million sea otters that were around globally. And in the black line, you can see that is the native range of sea otters before the fur trade. And luckily, we did have small pockets of sea otters that survived the fur trade. And so you can see there's a small pocket off of the coast of California. That's about 50 sea otters, and those are stemming from all the southern sea otters in California. Currently, there's about 3,000 stem from the surviving 50 of the fur trade. So their genetic diversity is very low. So worldwide, sea otters have slowly recovered, thankfully, and reached high numbers in some areas of their historical range. But southern sea otters, as I mentioned, only inhabit about 13% of their former range and remain absent from the Oregon coast. So we did have a translocation effort in the 1970s. And if you want to learn a lot more about that, we have a YouTube presentation on that from our board president, Bob Bailey. And he's also going to give that same presentation on April 1st at the Coos History Museum. And no, that is not an April Fool's. So in the 1970s, sea otters from Amchitka Island were moved to Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Southeast Alaska to escape nuclear testing in 1969 to 1972. I apologize. So nearly 100 animals were released at Cape Arago and Port Orford, but none of these sea otters were tagged, so that wasn't very helpful when trying to track individual movements of those sea otters. Some animals appear to have soon left the area after their release, while others did not. Even though they did have pups, in some places, the entire population of animals declined dramatically by 1975 and disappeared completely by 1981. And that's most likely due to immediate immigration, which likely left the remaining population below the level needed to withstand expected mortalities. So a sea otter translocation in Oregon today would differ from the 1970s effort in several important ways due to advancements in science, policy, and public understanding of both sea otter ecology and conservation needs. So let's talk about who's the Elakha Alliance. If you don't know who we are, we officially became a nonprofit in 2020, the 501c3. But the idea behind the Elakha Alliance actually started in 1999 by the late David Hatch, who is seen there wearing a sea otter robe. He was from the Siletz tribe, and he was naming a boat he was building with his son and came across the word Elakha in a Chinook trade jargon dictionary. And then that led to many years of questioning what happened to Oregon sea otters. Why are they culturally significant? How can we bring them back? And unfortunately, he passed away suddenly in 2016, but his passion ignited in numerous people, and thus a board of directors was created, and that's how we became a nonprofit. We're a small but mighty staff of 3.5. Alongside our passionate board of directors, we have letters of support from every coastal tribe with this endeavor, and we have 3 tribes represented currently on our board of directors. So our mission is to restore a healthy population of sea otters to the Oregon coast, and in the process, help make Oregon's marine ecosystem more robust and resilient. And I want to highlight that restoring the marine ecosystem is crucial in our mission because it affects us all. So in 2022, we published a scientific feasibility study. We hired the top 6 sea otter scientists of the world and said, figure out, is it feasible to bring sea otters back to the Oregon coast? So the 5 key takeaways were that reintroductions have been successful and that reintroducing sea otters to their former habitats has been the single most management action for recovery, helping to bring otters from near extinctions in parts of the Eastern and North Pacific. So approximately 30% of today's global number of otters is due to successful reintroduction efforts in Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, and Washington. Secondly, reintroducing sea otters is likely to succeed if done carefully. So a reintroduced population is likely to be viable if enough animals are released to appropriate habitats. And we have the ORSO model was created out of this feasibility study, the Oregon Sea Otter model, to where you can go on to our website yourself and you can input 50 sea otters, male sea otters, 40 female sea otters, and pick a place on the Oregon coast where they have suitable habitat, and you can see statistically over time if it's likely to succeed. Let me drink a little second. And number 3, estuaries may be a key place for reintroduction. So alongside nearshore ocean habitats like kelp forests, several Oregon estuaries may be suitable for a founding sea otter population, especially with all of that research I talked about before about how beneficial sea otters are in estuaries. And reintroducing sea otters will have many positive and negative direct and indirect effects. So as a keystone species, sea otters have uncommonly strong ecosystem effects, including direct effects on prey species like Dungeness crab, and indirect effects like increases in kelp forests and eelgrass beds that in turn increase finfish and invertebrate species they rely on. And number 5, excuse me, social, economic, legal, and regulatory issues must be considered. Basically, we just need to reach out to a lot of stakeholders that would be impacted by this reintroduction. But overall, they said it was feasible. Now, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published their own feasibility assessment in 2022 on the reintroduction of sea otters in Northern California and Oregon. And they ultimately concluded that reintroducing sea otters to Oregon is ecologically feasible and could have significant benefits for marine ecosystem health. However, successful reintroduction would require careful planning, collaboration with stakeholders, and a solid management plan to address potential conflicts and ensure the long-term success of the sea otter population in Oregon. I want to note that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has not taken a position on whether to move forward, but they also said it was feasible. So what are our next steps? Currently, we're doing a lot of outreach and public engagement. So a lot of the people I meet every day, tabling at events or speaking to classrooms, they still don't know that sea otters are not present on the Oregon coast. And so that's why we continue our work to engage the community and also talk about the importance of our kelp forest marine ecosystems. We're also upping our political advocacy this year. So I'll have a QR code pop up soon. And if you live in Oregon, you can just scan that and it'll take you directly to an action page where you fill out your information and it sends a letter directly to your state and federal reps that you want sea otters back in Oregon. We're also working on tribal engagement and leadership. So we are working closely with tribes on a sea otter reintroduction plan or recommendations that they may have. And then also doing funding research projects and gathering information, filling gaps that were in our feasibility study, working on a shell fisheries impact report. We published a South Coast tourism impact study, which concluded about $3.5 million of estimated revenue for if sea otters were reintroduced to Southern Oregon, just for people to come view them for wildlife viewing, which is huge. Oh yeah, there's the QR code. I'll leave up for a second. If you are an Oregon resident and want to let your representatives know, this is an important thing for you. It's also on our website. I can put it in the chat too. We are also exploring alternative strategies for restoring a population or populations of sea otters to Oregon, including innovative leadership models and partnerships that involve the state of Oregon and coastal tribes. We will continue to support and facilitate U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decision-making and leadership, but we will also investigate the legal and policy landscapes that can enable tribal or state entities to lead and or manage the restoration of a sea otter population here in Oregon. So if you are on social media, would love if you gave us a follow. I run all those channels, so I'll check tonight if you follow us. We also have a really robust YouTube channel that has all our previous presentations. It's a wealth of information as well as our website. You can get there by going to OregonSeaOtters.org or ElakhaAlliance.org, but seems like OregonSeaOtters.org might be a little easier to remember. How you can help. We put out a monthly raft newsletter that comes from yours truly. So you can also use that QR code on the left up there to sign up for that directly. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, so obviously individual donations are very helpful, and there's a QR code for that. We do have monthly donors, which help us keep us on track. And then just by continuing to spread the message that sea otters are missing in Oregon and they're culturally significant, a keystone species, and would economically positively impact the coastal ecosystem, that's huge. That will help me in my job as the outreach and community organizer, so that would be very helpful. We are an alliance, so obviously we don't work by ourselves, thanks to a lot of these amazing partners that we work with that are also passionate about ocean conservation, including Oregon Wild. Thank you. And I will end with this. So it's very rare, but we do sometimes have lone male sea otters that swim down from the Washington population, which is the closest population here in Oregon. And they're looking for rafts of females. But guess what? We don't have any, so they don't stick around for long. So they usually swim back up, or sometimes, unfortunately, they might get bit by a shark and wash ashore deceased. But these two guys were around Cannon Beach at Ecola Point for several weeks. And volunteer Brett Williard filmed this and let us use this footage, and it's fantastic. But after 4th of July, they weren't seen again. And I luckily was able to go and see them for myself. And that was truly amazing. And here's a photograph from that. And if you saw it in the media several months ago, they used all of my photographs. So that was my picture. So now you know, a really cool published photographer in the news. But that concludes my presentation. So I see there's like 20 questions in the Q&A. So I will stop. Should I stop sharing, Danielle?
Yeah, that'd be great. And we can share out the resources like your QR code and all those things in the follow-up email. So thank you, Chanel. That was great. Before we get into questions and have Chanel and perhaps myself, depending on what the questions are, help answer them, I just wanted to take a minute just to talk about Oregon Wild and our wildlife program. So first and foremost, we work to address species decline in Oregon, especially as the biodiversity crisis or extinction crisis intensifies. So we are doing everything we can to ensure that all native species can thrive in the state, and that we're really investing in the recovery of those species. And so we work a lot to secure additional funding for wildlife conservation efforts. Within that, we work a lot on the protection and restoration of keystone species, which is obviously why sea otters are really important to our work as well, in addition to wolves, beavers, and many other species. And so I have the honor of serving on Elakha Alliance's advisory council, where we get to work together and partner on a lot of advocacy efforts and outreach and other community engagement opportunities. So we really appreciate that. Because again, as this biodiversity crisis continues to intensify, we need to be addressing the root causes of it and making sure all species are able to thrive in Oregon. And so just for a couple upcoming opportunities, and stay tuned, follow our website at oregonwild.org, or email me directly. But the legislative session in Oregon is starting next week, so there will be a lot of opportunities to make your voices heard to our elected officials around a lot of important wildlife issues, especially related to funding this important work. And then furthermore, the state is currently in process to review and update our wildlife action plan, which is essentially the blueprint for protecting and recovering our most imperiled species. And so there's some efforts to make sure sea otters are a feature in this program, in this plan, and a lot of other keystone species. And so there will be opportunities coming up for the public to make your voices heard and to comment on that plan. And so we'll be sharing out those opportunities in the coming months. But anyway, just want to take a moment to connect dots and thank Elakha Alliance, because we are, again, excited and eager to bring sea otters back to Oregon. And so happy to help in any way we can. So like you said, we have a lot of questions. So we'll typically our webcasts end around 7. We might hang on till about 7:10 and get these questions answered, and we might not get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So Chanel, let's kick off with, do you know on average how many sea otters live in a raft of like a healthy population? And then the person wants to know if they heard correctly that they live in rafts by sex, or do they mix?
Yeah, great question. It kind of depends on how large the population is in a certain area, depending on the size of rafts. There's some of, 30 to 50 to hundreds, based on the location. Alaska is where 90% of all sea otters live in the world. That's the largest population. So oftentimes they're in very large rafts. But in Monterey, there was seen rafts of several hundred during big storm events. So they may not be all together all at once when there's nice calm waters, but they usually gather if there's big waves and storms. So it varies. And yeah, they often are separated by sex in rafts. So usually females are hanging out together because they have pups and help one another if one dives down often to keep a lookout on their pup. Um, but males are a little more free-spirited and kind of can roam around to all the rafts of females looking to make new friends.
That feels familiar. It feels familiar, as my children are with another mom right now. So while we do this webcast, and there was a question about if you happen to know if the numbers of sea otters have decreased in the Aleutian arc at all. I don't know if you know that specifically, Chanel, but
I know around some of the Aleutian Islands, their numbers have decreased due to orca predation, but I don't know the exact numbers.
sure, makes sense.
Oh, sorry about that.
Somebody asked, we know what beaver pelts were used for, and they were just curious if you could talk a little bit more about what sea otter pelts were used for during the fur trade.
Yeah, so the Chinese really valued the sea otter pelts to wear adorn as jackets and blankets and hats and that kind of thing. So they turned them mostly into clothing pieces.
Sure.
Yeah, and it also kept you really warm. Fancy that.
Yeah,
Sadly.
that makes sense. Okay, there are several questions. This will probably be unsurprising to you about the just impacts to Dungeness crab.
Yeah.
And actually, we had somebody say they just received a response from Senator Merkley's office, I think, and possibly response to our action alert from during Sea Otter Awareness Week, actually.
Mhm.
So just I don't know if you can speak to some of the concerns of impacts on the Dungeness crab population and in just those that fishery, but yeah, if you
Yeah.
can speak to that.
Yeah, I'll first start by we are having open communications with the Dungeness Crab Commission and presenting to them a lot. Um, and so uh, it's, it's varied what will happen. But if we take Washington, for example, where they reintroduced sea otters in the 70s, over the last decade or so, with sea otters being present, the Dungeness crab catch has gone up.
Mm.
So that's the most likely similar ecosystem that we can compare to Oregon. And the commercial crab fishermen fish off of the coast or in deep waters where sea otters would not be present. And so ultimately, sea otters would be most likely closer to shore, where crabs have the ability to go deeper in the water to hide from sea otters who can't dive that far. They do predate on Dungeness crab, but I don't think at the capacity that'll really impact any commercial crabbing. Um, and they also eat, 100+ different other species. So they're not just eating Dungeness crab and that's it as well. So, and it's also good to know that sea otters grow at a very slow pace. They only have one pup a year, and if that pup survives, so it's not like there's going to be thousands of sea otters eating all the things. So it's just about getting misinformation kind of kaput and just stating the facts that we have from real data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that on that too, it's like there's concern about some of those direct impacts, predator-prey relationship. But I think what isn't talked about, which I appreciate in your talk, is that just the restoration of the ecosystem broadly and what kind of impacts those will have, perhaps more indirect. And so just thinking about how more species could thrive and what all of that trickle down might be. It's hard to also be able to specifically calculate that because we've had sea otters gone for so long too. And so we know the current baseline, we know what the ecosystem in its degraded state, but what actually could happen if, the restoration happened.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to touch upon that. Sea otters, as we know from everyone now knows, sea otters are a keystone species helping maintain the kelp forest and estuary ecosystems, which are nurseries to larval Dungeness crab and all the rockfish that people love to eat as well. So over time, sea otters are a long-term solution to helping impact the ecosystem positively. So over time, Eventually, hopefully, with a thriving ecosystem, all those numbers will increase of, Dungeness crab and rockfish and other fin fishes that we all, well, I don't eat them, but a lot of people do eat them.
That other people rely on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
No problem. I don't think you mentioned this, but is there a record of like fishermen or other potential hunters shooting those transplanted sea otters in the 70s?
There's not records, but I have heard that that did happen just from stories passed down, but there's no record, and that's highly illegal. So don't do that.
Yeah,
But there's no record, but I believe it was highly possible that that did happen to a couple of them, sadly.
that's good to know. Thank you. Um, what are the existing estuaries along the Oregon coast? I don't know how
Yeah,
many there are, so I don't know if you can name all of them, but maybe a few or yeah.
yeah, we've got Coos Bay, Yaquina Bay, Tillamook Bay. Those are kind of the largest ones that we have.
Great. Could northern and southern sea otters reproduce if their ranges came close enough to each other in the future?
Yes, there's really not any significant difference between the subspecies, just kind of geographically.
Mhm.
Northern subspecies are a little larger in size because they're in colder waters up in Alaska, British Columbia area. But yes, they can definitely intermingle with each other.
Great. And then you mentioned this, I think, early on in your presentation, and somebody also asked a question just about if you could speak to the fact of essentially allowing for natural migration or a natural recovery on their own. Somebody wanted to know why, there isn't
Yeah.
just perhaps allowing for that to happen.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, about 1/3 of all sea otters today are due to successful translocation efforts because sea otters are not a migratory species. So unless there's human intervention and capturing them and taking them in an airplane somewhere or in a car, they don't naturally just be like, oh, I forgot my ancestors lived off of the Oregon coast, so I must go back home. um, so the closest population is in Washington. And like I said, sometimes we do get some lone males coming down looking for rafts of females because they have the freedom and opportunity to go and do that. Unlike females who are just super single moms, having pups and redoing that every single year. They don't have the freedom to move around and they're happy and stable in their ecosystem. So really, the male sea otters moving are just looking for procreation, not for habitat. And so the northern population or the California population has not expanded naturally up the coast because of several factors of degradation of kelp and also juvenile white sharks have increased off of the northern California coastline. And so with those factors, that's why there is also an effort to reintroduce sea otters in Northern California because right now the population is at a standstill. Basically, they're not growing or expanding because they just don't have habitat to naturally expand to. In Alaska, a lot of people are like, well, sea otters repopulated Alaska at an amazing rate. They have a totally different ecosystem and coastline than we do. They have a long linear coastline of the most perfect sea otter habitat you can imagine. And so they just naturally have expanded there. The rocky coast of Oregon does not allow for that.
Is it true that great whites, they are interested in sea otters and go to eat them, but then because of the fur and they misidentify them essentially as either, a seal or sea lion, and so they bite, but they don't necessarily eat them. So they
Yeah,
die from just being bit, which is
correct.
they're
Yeah.
gonna do it.
So a
Like,
lot of times we say, so juvenile white sharks usually are coming from eating fish to transitioning to eating marine mammals. So a sea otter looks like a seal or a sea lion from below. So they go and take a bite and get a mouthful of fur and no juicy blubber fat that they're looking for. And they're like, oh, gross, a hairball, and then let go. And then usually that bite is super fatal for the sea otter because it breaks their fur, which is how they keep warm or, worse. So yeah, they don't chew on the sea otter or eat it. It just gets let go.
That's such an unfortunate,
I
unfortunate
know,
in all ways. It's like if you're gonna bite it, eat it. But
right?
um, I don't know if enough of these details are out. There's some questions about like where might they be reintroduced and things like that. But one person wanted to know what might be done differently in this reintroduction or translocation process than the 1970s. And I think you touched on that just in general monitoring and like, just
Yeah.
other things, but I don't know if you have more specifics to add.
Yeah, there's I know Brittany Blades, she was on here earlier. She's the marine mammal curator for the Oregon Coast Aquarium, who's working in a reintroduction like thought group on translocation efforts. She may answer this better than I will, but yeah, there's a lot of different updated methods, technology, understanding of sea otter biology and ecology and transportation methods. They also didn't tag any of the sea otters in the 70s, so that was a really missed opportunity. There wasn't a lot of steady um, data collection as well. So there's just a lot of things that maybe fell through the cracks in the 70s that definitely wouldn't happen now. Um,
Mhm.
yeah. You
Yeah, and
can,
it was also just before the Endangered Species Act, and not the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but Endangered Species Act. So I think there's just a lot more done in science and research and monitoring for
yeah,
these relocations or reintroductions. Um, and then I think it's 7:06, so we're gonna go to 7:10. I think we have enough to round us out to
yeah,
7:10. But one question, and I've gotten this in a couple different ways, just in general, do we think the population would come from the northern sea otter population or southern or a mix? Any thoughts, or is there analysis on that yet?
yeah. So ultimately, that's up to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to determine everything about the translocation, basically. So it's up to them to decide. Um, Northern subspecies are not listed as threatened, so the southern subspecies are. So there's a lot more red tape when it comes to translocating a threatened or endangered species than it is one that's not listed.
Mhm.
So it might be easier overall to do northern and then supplement over time with southern subspecies from the Monterey Bay Aquarium's surrogacy program, where they take in abandoned pups and have a surrogate mom, and then they can release them back into the wild. So that is an option, but nothing is set in stone, so to speak, about which subspecies they're going to pick.
Here's a great one. How much money do we think this will cost to reintroduce the otters to Oregon?
I believe US Fish said between like 23 to 43 million. Don't quote
Mhm.
me on that. I'm pretty sure it's somewhere around there. But yeah, it's very expensive. So that's also a roadblock
Yeah.
is where do we find funds to do a
Mhm.
translocation?
Yeah, but even in the terrestrial side of things with beavers or wolves or other species, there's definitely a conversation around these, sort of natural climate solutions or ecosystem engineers, and obviously not just bringing them back for their, you know, because these species deserve to thrive, but also even just the mitigation of cost for dealing with the effects of climate change. You obviously talked about the nearshore environment. So, it might seem like a really big cost, of course, up front to bring them back, but then what are the long-term benefits for having them back in the environment and things that then now we don't need to mitigate as challenges in the ocean as a result of having them. So, again, these
Yeah.
analyses are sometimes done in a vacuum, but really thinking about the big picture of what it could mean as well. Okay, this will end on this one. I think this is probably top of mind given the inauguration of the next president on Monday, but just if you have any parting thoughts on kind of how Elakha Alliance is thinking about the next few years, especially with the changing administration, and maybe, you know, what are opportunities for people to engage and continue to move this forward despite an very unknown of what's to come in that realm.
So I mentioned that we're kind of looking at alternative options of translocation efforts. So really engaging with state Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Service, so state representatives or not representatives, but employees, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, I talked a lot. My brain's a little mushy.
I got you.
And also really engaging with our tribal partners, and maybe there's something where state and tribes can work together on really making a translocation effort happen. So we're kind of working on some more ideas than we have in the past. And what was the other part of your question?
Just things people can do to stay
Oh, yeah.
engaged in. Yeah. And you
So
shared some
like
of those resources.
that action alert. So it's really important to keep sea otters in the minds of your state and federal reps and elected officials, that it is important that they know that we're not going anywhere. We want sea otters back for the betterment of all Oregonians and, you know, the ecosystem and our wildlife to have a better marine ecosystem out on the Oregon coast. And to also how important it is culturally to our tribes to bring back a family member, as they have mentioned before, back to their communities. So it's really crucial that this just doesn't go quiet and dormant over the next 4 years, that it's really big.
Yep.
Really big.
And these take time, so we need to build that momentum now. Can't let up. I saw in the chat, I think there was a clarification. The money you mentioned for reintroduction, from Jane, who is the executive director of the Elakha Alliance, said over 10 years. So I think it was 23 million over 10 years is what I'm assuming she meant. So thank you, Jane, for that. And then we have just some questions about the resources and things we've talked about. So when Oregon Wild sends out our follow-up email tomorrow, we will include the recording. We will include all the things that Chanel has shared and things I've mentioned. So all of that will be there. And then sign up for both of our email lists if you're not already. And I'm sure you will learn about all those upcoming opportunities to make your voices heard for sea otters. So thank you all for hanging on. Thank you, Chanel, for your great presentation. Go rest your voice. I hope.
I know, I'm so sorry. I don't know why.
I appreciate that you practiced. That means you were ready to go and it showed. So, but thank you everyone, and we'll see you for our next webcast. So have a great evening and take care. Bye.
Bye.